Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a nice day wherever you are. My name is Karen. I'll be your moderator for the first half of this session. I work with the Global Partnership as a policy officer. Today is the last day in terms of our last expert dialogue. We're focusing on Namibia today, and we'll hear more about Namibia. If you're joining us for the first time, just to let you know how we run these expert dialogues, we have two parts. Part one, we hear some opening remarks from UNECA. Then we do a short recap of a Namibia case study, and then we respond to a few questions that we've received. And then we move to part two, where we allow comments from new participants, and that will be moderated by my colleague Zoran. Just for your benefit, a few housekeeping. One, we have this webinar, this expert dialogue in 2 languages. So if you prefer to listen to this conversation in French, if you look to the bottom left of your CUDA window, the white button that says flow, you click there and you select your preferred language, which will be French or English. And when we get to part 2, where we'll do the conversation or the Q&A, will allow participants to speak. And to do that, to the bottom right of your CUDA window, there's a button which says request to speak. So if you want to speak, you click on that. It will notify us that you'd like to speak, and will allow you onto the floor and you can speak. And just so you know, we welcome comments both in French and English. So if you're French speaking and you want to give your comments, you're very much welcome to do that. So without further ado, I'd like to invite William to provide some opening remarks. Over to you, William.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. Welcome to this last webinar on Namibia. It's a very interesting webinar because it is actually showing us how we can utilize information which we collect in civil registration. We have actually been concentrating on what we can do as civil registration, but now we are actually moving to the utility of data collected from civil registration systems. So the example of Namibia gives us one of those aspects I mentioned in my earlier remarks, that we want to move countries to the point where they have interoperable civil registration, ID, and vital statistics systems. And for that to happen, the countries should actually have what are called national population registers. And there are quite a number of good examples on the continent. I know Kenya is striving to build its national population register. Zambia, it is also building its INRIS. Nigeria is building its NIMS. So we already have countries which are striving to build their population registers. So what is a population register, which Namibia has and which they utilized during the COVID pandemic to select people who could be put on the social welfare system? So the population register is actually an individualized data system. So it contains everybody in a population, and it's updated as children are born or infants are born and they are enrolled in that population, and people are enrolled out as they die. So this population register is a system of continuous recording and coordinated linkage of selected information pertaining to each member of the resident population. So if you remember very well how we do censuses, we actually collect individual information. And it's the same here, but this information is updated regularly. So as the person enters into the next phase, that information is actually updated. And these population registers, like the one in Namibia, have about 3 purposes. The first one being the administrative purpose. For example, the social welfare system, which it was used for. It has a statistical purpose. So in countries where population registers are working very well, we can get real-time census information, complete information about that population. And the third use is actually the human rights issue part of it. So we can use the population registers to issue ID cards, to issue birth certificate, and to issue death certificates. So we actually need to see what's the relationship between the civil register, which we do in civil registration offices, and the population register. So the civil registers carries primarily the provision of legal documents and statistical purposes. And it's limited to the collection and registration of vital events. So in civil registry, we register vital events and it stops there. But in the population register, it is carried primarily to establish the size of the population, the whole population, to help in the planning of state services. It includes all the events covered by the civil registration system. And the most important to be recorded concerns life events and place of residence. So with population registers, you know where the people are. And what are the benefits? So it enables government to derive robust statistical data. It links individuals to records, to physical addresses. And it is quite important to emphasize here that this has proved to be very useful during the COVID pandemic, because individual records and linking people where they are has been quite essential in terms of providing services, in providing or in tracking who has been infected, and that they, in countries with advanced system like South Africa, where they've developed some software to actually indicate if you are close to somebody or you have gotten close to somebody who has COVID. And functioning population registers are inherently lead to the appreciation of the value of civil registration systems. So this is very, very critical, because it actually, once a population register is in place, the only way it can be updated is a functioning civil registration system. So it elevates the need to have functioning civil registration systems. So to end, I would encourage that during the phase which we are going in, we are seeing the value of national population registers. That's why we have actually asked Namibia to come and show us what were the advantages they generated from the population registers. And we would actually encourage countries to go in that direction. Let me say that we actually have a team of experts here at ECA will be available to support countries as they build their national population registers. As of now, there are a number of countries, 10 of them in Africa, which we are working with, and we are actually driving the process of having them build the population registers. So thank you, and we hope to hear from you as you advance into the next phase or into the next generation of civil registration, which is actually population registers. And we look forward to you to reach out to us and request for this technical assistance. Thank you. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, William. I think those were really powerful opening remarks and, really building momentum or sort of setting the scene for Tulimeke Munyinka to take over, giving us a recap. Just for the benefit of colleagues who are joining us, who've joined us now, we're doing this in two parts. We're in part one, where we're doing some intro and recap and responding to a few questions, and then we'll move to part two, which is a longer version, a longer part of this expert dialogue, where we'll have a chance to, interact, ask more questions, and hear from you. And in order to hear from you, we'll request you, if you want to ask a question, if you want to, give a comment, the process is to the bottom right of your Kudo window. There's a button which says request to speak. Once you click on that, we'll know that you want to speak, and we'll allow you or allow you to have a chance to speak. So I'll move right to you, Tuli, to just give a short recap of the Namibia case. I think this is for the benefit of colleagues who did not join the webinar in December, where you presented this case study at length. So Tuli, over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. I hope I can be heard. You're nodding, so I think it's the same for everybody else. Good day to everybody. My name is Tulimeke. I am the director responsible for the National Population Register Identification and Production in Namibia, and I'm quite privileged to be able to have the 5 minutes now in order to share what Namibia has done. And also thank you, William, for that introduction that really saved me some time. So I won't have to say some things because you've already said them, so I can use my 5 minutes wisely. Just to get into it, and I will not go to some of the general information, but we all know that during the problem now, the pandemic that we are in, which is COVID-19, all of us have had to struggle to try and put things in place in order to assist our nations. So in Namibia, our first positive COVID-19 case was sometimes in March, when the first 2 cases were reported. And everything moved really fast. The first cases were reported on 14 March, and by 17 March, the president had declared a state of emergency. In the same month, we went in a lockdown. In April, that lockdown was extended, and then all the way up to June. So you can imagine, just like it happened in many other places, the effects of the lockdown were really that some people lost their jobs. Some were sent home for a while to return. Others were permanently laid off. Businesses closed. So salary cuts and then the economic downturn really had an effect. What I want to talk about today is really what was government's response to the arrival of COVID-19 and the effects that it actually had on the nation. From the side of civil registration, okay, initially for the state of emergency, after it was announced, there had to be state of emergency regulations that were passed. What was key in these regulations was that the section in the Identification Act, which provides for the secrecy of all the information that is contained in the population register, was suspended. So we have a provision in the law that says everything that is in the population register is secret, and that blanket is very general. The only exception is where as Home Affairs, as civil registration, we are sharing this information with certain government officers for official purposes. And I'll explain later that in the administration of the grant, a private company was contracted to administer. So in order for us to allow that administration to take place legally, that provision in the law had to be suspended, but it was very clear that it's only being suspended for the purpose of the administration of grants, of state grants, because of COVID-19. The government released a stimulus package, and among the stimulus package that was announced in the country, there was a grant called Emergency Income Grant. The time period to apply for this grant was quite short. I'm not going to go through all the requirements that one had to meet in order to qualify, but the key requirements were you had to be a Namibian citizen, you had to be between the age of 18 and 59, and then you had to have an identity card, and you must not be receiving any other grant. Maybe I can mention here already that in Namibia, our civil registration system, the population register that we use, is both civil registration and identity management. They are one and the same system. So where you have all your vital events, the ID information is also on exactly the same system. So this is what actually made the population register the best place to verify from, because you had to know, we had to be sure you were actually a citizen, you were within the correct age group, and that you had an ID card. It was very specific that you needed to have an ID card. Civil registration during the time of COVID-19 was actually regarded as an essential service. Initially, and I'm not sure whether it happened like this in most places, when COVID-19 just landed, when it just appeared, we had to close. Everybody had to close. Government was trying to put in place the necessary things in order to make sure that people are safe, even in the workplaces. Now, what we saw with the announcement of the emergency income grant is there was suddenly such a huge demand for IDs. Blessing in disguise for us, it worked. And this really pushes us through to even meeting SDG 16.9, having an identity for all people in Namibia. The verification also did not put any strain on the population register. We have seen and we have drawn a number of reports that show us that births continue to be registered, deaths also continue to be registered, also because we didn't close, and because the deaths and births are actually notified electronically from the health facilities where they occur onto the notification system, which is together really it's the same system as the National Population Register, which administers, from which we administer the population register. What exactly was the use of the system? We had to confirm that the applicant was alive and not dead. The death register is a component of the population register. The way it is actually organized is that I have a profile on the register. It contains the birth register that has my birth. When I get married, my marriage information is at the same place. Information regarding my death would also be in the same place, and my ID would also be, my ID information would also be there. So it's like a system that was really built to be resilient. Maybe we did not foresee something like COVID, but it had really worked out perfectly. How did it work for you to apply for the emergency income grant? You nominate yourself via a text message. The information moves from the mobile operator to the private company that was contracted to run the whole process. Then the verifications start from there. When you nominate yourself, you indicate your full names, what your ID number is, then MobiPay, I'm going to call them MobiPay, that is the name of the company. They would then verify against various systems, and the first stop was the population register for us to check dead, alive, citizenship, age bracket, and valid ID. Details. Just a bit of numbers. I've got very little time. By the end of the verification process, the result was actually that more people applied, and the people who could apply were those that had lost. What is the correct English word? People who had lost jobs, people that were unemployed and they had no other form of income. Close to 1 million applications were received, which was much higher than the number that government had anticipated. And over 2 million entries were actually verified against the population register. I mean, this was caused by a number of things. Some of them were just repeat applications where I would apply and give the same information over and over again. Maybe just as what was the result? How exactly did the CR system ensure that there were controls in the system? A number of applications were rejected because when they were run against the population register, the ID numbers belonged to people that had already died. Some were rejected because the applicants did not fall within the correct category. They were not within the correct age bracket. And some of them were just rejected because the information that they gave does not even exist on the systems that we have. Really, this was the key collaboration there was between the CR system and private sector that was administering this on behalf of the government. But it taught us a lot of lessons and it also gave us a lot of opportunities. It's important that every person has got a legal identity from birth. Maybe when I get to deal with the questions, I can deal a bit about how the notification system actually works very smoothly to actually ensure that we try to capture the births as soon as they occur before the mother actually leaves the hospital. The system is quite robust, it's digitized, it's interoperable, and it worked very swiftly. Everything was verified within the period that the applications were open. Every week, verifications were being done. Mobile technology, people could apply from wherever they were in the country. You did not even need to own the cell phone. You could use another person's cell phone for you to apply. But it also really showed us that an identity is a very powerful tool in the hands of the person that holds it. But not only was this already known to us as CR officials, but even the population, the populace got to actually add more value to an identity card. After that, we've continued to get many applications for IDs because people now see why it's important to have an ID. So yeah, that's basically how the civil registration system was used in the administration of the grant. After your identity was then verified, then they would check it against other systems such as the student financing. Are you receiving a loan as a student? Then you would be disqualified. Are you actually paying tax actively? You have not lost your job. Then you would also not be eligible to get the grant. But the first stop was the CR system. It worked seamlessly. We did not, as I conclude, we did not give access to the private company to access the population register. They had to give us lists, very long lists of the applicants they had, and then this information was verified by ourselves against our system, which is hosted by the Prime Minister's office, to run the verifications for them and send them back. Yeah, I think I have covered almost everything. Let me check. Yes, that is sort of, that is a recap of a presentation that I did earlier on. I'll be happy to take questions. Karen?
Super. Thank you so much, Tuli. That was a really nice recap for the benefit of colleagues who were not there during the webinar in December, but also to trigger some questions from the audience. I think I have like 4 questions. I feel like you've responded to one, and just so maybe I'll move to the second question because I think you've touched on verification of the identity cards, but feel free to touch on that. And just for the benefit of colleagues who are joining, these questions, we received them from participants as they were registering for this expert dialogue. So Julie, I think I'll start with the second question that we received. And I'd want you to just touch on some of the barriers you have faced and what are some of the strategies you've taken to overcome some of these barriers, whether it's in this process of the grants or just strengthening CRVS in Namibia. And I think countries who are on the call would really greatly benefit from your suggestions on effectively planning for CRVS activities.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. I should mention, like, just from the very beginning, none of us anticipated there would be COVID-19. We did not know that we'd have to use the system in the way that we used them. We used the system. But what actually happened was, in the very beginning, mid-March, I think everybody went into panic mode. So everybody had to leave. So one of the initial thing was actually having to deal with the human aspect. Yes, there is COVID-19. You can still come to the office. You can still work. We had to reinstate. Some of the barriers were really the health risk for the administration, for CR to move forward. And for us, it was mostly the IDs, because nobody wanted to be at work in contact with another person. So we needed reassurance that things were actually going to be okay. And we needed the CR staff that understanding that this is actually much bigger than ourselves. There are certain people who rely on, who need that emergency income grant, and therefore we had to do everything that we needed to do. Some of the challenges that we've had, some of the barriers that were there, let me maybe start from the very beginning, which is birth registration. Our birth registration rate in the country is still, it was slightly, as from the official 2016 stats that we have, still slightly lower than death registration. Now, if birth registration doesn't take place, you would not be able to graduate and get an ID when you turn 16. So some of the barriers that were there, not for us, but for members of the public who needed an ID, was that some people couldn't actually access the grant because they had no ID. That was the biggest problem. But on CRVS, some of the problems the barriers that we still have are, not every birth is registered the way that we want. It should be registered on time and try to avoid late registration. Birth registration is free, so people can still apply wherever. But that is like one of the biggest barriers that we have. But to overcome that, what we have had to do is we have decentralized services to hospitals. Registrars, birth registration actually happens in the hospital. We have offices in hospitals where as soon as the woman gives birth, in fact, the hospital staff would notify the birth as soon as it happens. And then when the mother presents himself to a registrar, the registrar goes onto the population register, which is online, to see that the notification was already done and they could already register the birth. And then the person's legal identity is already established from there for them to be able to get an ID even later. Our collaboration, even for CRVS, it could be better with other stakeholders. We should be able to what we did now with the emergency income grant, we should be able to do with all the other stakeholders that administer grants, especially government. But we are not yet there to be linked electronically for that to happen. But that is one of the things that we're doing. We have entered into MOUs with Ministry of Gender, for example. They administer children's grants. We need to do that for all the other components of social protection to actually make sure that there is credibility, there is a level of integrity in the system, there is not fraud going on. The barriers were there. We are still continuing. As I speak now, we are actually going into the field. With the help of UNICEF, we have gotten a team that can help us do a study on what are the access barriers to birth registration in those areas where birth registration is very low. So we've taken 4 regions that have the lowest birth registration, and we're starting now already from next week to try and go and study and develop policy. What exactly can we find that can help us with policy formulation? I hope I've covered that succinctly.
You actually covered a little more, because there's a question I had later, which you've sort of touched on. But I think I want you to just touch also in terms of the legal framework, and whether you've had to revise, whether you've had to change the legal framework. What have been some of the lessons in terms of this process with the legal framework?
Okay, the other one I have spoken about in the recap, that we had to specifically suspend one clause in the Identification Act that would enable us to do the verifications. When the current law that we use for registration of vital events is actually quite old, it comes from the 60s. And when it was drafted based on a manual system. What we are doing at the moment, we've actually revised the law. We have taken the standalone pieces of legislation on CR and put them under one act that we're really hoping will get to Parliament in the first part of this year. And what we have done is to redraft the law so that it also takes into account the fact that what we are actually doing now is not a manual system anymore. It is actually electronic. All the notifications that we are doing are electronic. But what I should mention is, although the law is old, we were able to implement the notification system without amending the law at the time, because the law was not prohibitive on notifying or doing the registration in a computerized manner, if I would, because the systems as we speak are running on electronic notifications. So we've made sure that the law that is coming will be adapted for it to be able to speak to the law in place. The other thing is, on this particular provision of the law that creates that secrecy protection, in the new law, we have done a bit of comprehensive work on data protection and information sharing to make sure that, and it really has also a lot to do with the social protection system. Whoever it is that administers a grant or some kind of, even insurance, even if they are private, there should be room for them to be able to verify the identity before they can make any payout from insurance. So for the particular exercise of administering the grant, it was one provision, but in the long run, we have actually done more comprehensive work that even private sector, if everything goes according to plan, should be able to also sit wherever they are and do certain verifications themselves.
Great. I have one more question, and I promise this is the last before we move to part 2 to allow other ask questions. I see the questions are coming in through the chat. So I'm just keen to learn, how do you develop cooperation links between health institutions, civil registration institutions to improve birth and death notification systems? I think earlier you mentioned that the death registration rates, are much higher than the birth registration rate. So I'm sure participants are keen to know, what are some of your tips or strategies to strengthen this registration of both birth and death?
Thank you, Karen. At the moment, the current official statistics that we actually have from a 2016 a report by the Statistics Agency shows that our death registration rate was actually higher at 93.5% countrywide. Whereas birth registration is slightly lower with 87.8%. I think if Annette is here, she can maybe share the link in the chat box there so that people can have a look at the report if they're interested. What we have had to do was what I've spoken about, taking these services to the hospitals. We think the reason why death registration is higher is because it's incentivized. There are quite some benefits that you would get to claim. If you had insured your loved one, you'd be able to claim. You can't do it without a death certificate. And also a mortuary will not allow you to move a body without a removal order. And you'll only be able to get that removal order, the burial order, if the death is registered. So we have really seen that death registration, we'll have a census now, so maybe we'll even get better stats that are showing we have done much, much better. And although some deaths don't occur in hospitals, you have very few people, even if I don't have the numbers to substantiate it, who would just bury. Even if it's people who would not otherwise have had insurance and those kinds of benefits, because every death that occurs outside a health facility must be notified to the police. Now, even the police mortuary is connected to the notification system. What has actually helped on collaboration with us is for eBirth. It is really a project that was done with Ministry of Health. eDeath as well, having to get the police also on board. We have MOUs. In fact, for the e-notification system, the users that you would find there would be users from health, from the Ministry of Health, and also from the Ministry of Home Affairs. And at the moment, the Ministry of Home Affairs also includes safety and security, under which the Namibian police falls. So in terms of getting other stakeholders involved, our relationship with the Ministry of Health is very good. We in fact have a civil registration and vital statistics steering committee, which is made up of our executive directors and permanent secretaries, as they previously were called. Statistics agencies on that same committee, Office of the Prime Minister, they are also part of the committee. And there's a technical group, a technical committee under the same umbrella that we try to coordinate CRVS activities from a central place. It does not work smoothly like we would want it to work, but we are getting there, and hopefully with better computerized processes, it will even be smoother. So the cooperation is there. Where we can get better cooperation would also be to really have the insurance, the social protection sector really being connected to the system for them to do their own verifications. For death registration, the registration would also take place. The hospitals are also organized. So before we can register a death, ideally there must be a death notification so that we try to cut fraud from the processes.
Great. Thanks so much, Lumeke. I think this has been an interesting dialogue or exchange responding to the questions. I want to now invite my colleague Zoran to take over the second part of the expert dialogue. I think now, Tuli, you'll get more participants contributing to the conversation, asking more questions, definitely. But yeah, I look forward to a fruitful conversation in part 2. Over to you, Zoran.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you for this kind introduction. I'm happy to be here for the third time this week as part of this series of webinars highlighting good practices in civil registration and vital statistics, especially in the context of the ongoing COVID crisis. For those participants who were with us during the previous webinars, I will just re-highlight once again the format of these discussions is that this is not necessarily envisaged as a continuation of questions and answers with our colleague from Namibia, but also as a platform for broader discussion among experts who are participating in this webinar. So you are kindly invited to provide your general comment about what has been done in Namibia, what has been done in the context of your national system, if you are a practitioner coming from another country, or if you are working as a global expert, if you have some feedback on global experiences in this regard, so that we can expand the knowledge that we are discussing today as part of this webinar. For the facilitation of the discussion, I would just like to highlight that we really sincerely appreciate if you would decide to speak up live and address the audience of this webinar. For that, we have a facility, which is a blue button further down in the right corner. It says request mic. When you press that, we will have a notification on the screen that you would like to speak and provide your feedback or ask the question, which then I will make sure that the question comes through. You may as well ask your question through the facility of chat box. And in the course of the discussion, I will be having feedback from that side as well, and we'll be asking the questions. So to summarize, this is going to be an opportunity to further ask questions to our colleagues in Namibia, but also reflect on, in general, on population registers, on the role of civil registration and vital statistics system in the context of population register and various other services that can be provided through interoperability with other platforms. From my side, I just want to say at the beginning to highlight one of the hallmark of this discussion, and that is this service that has been provided within extremely limited period of time in such a aggravating situation that is COVID-19. And in a way, this whole webinar is an example of showcasing what a powerful instrument population register is, and what extraordinary powers governments what extraordinary instrument government can acquire by expanding interoperability between population register and other government services. So COVID came upon us, in this case in Namibia, in March. Within, I believe, 10-15 days, the executives in Namibia sat together and said, what instruments do we have at our disposal? Because literally we have a situation that likely some people are going to die because of this disease, but we want to prevent further casualties because people might be dying because of the lockdown and the cut off from certain resources that was providing for their livelihood. So in terms of powerful, having population register as a powerful instrument, it was sufficient 2 weeks perhaps, Tuli could clarify, to decide how this instrument can be utilized. And from that point onwards, within 3 months, great resources have been already distributed to precisely those people that are entitled to these services. So not approximation, but it is a very powerful instrument to pinpoint precisely the type of population that is in great need of support, and making sure that the distribution, that the funds are distributed to these people in a most facilitated manner. I thought at the beginning of this discussion that it would be useful to re-emphasize why we are discussing this system and why it is so important for broader discussion in the context of the civil registration, vital statistics strengthening on African continent, as well as globally, I dare to say. We have some questions, so I would like to start with those questions coming from the audience. And I also encourage anybody who is willing to take up the floor and address to us live to press request mic as well. I would like to say at the very beginning, maybe 3 questions coming together. First one is how the population registration system is institutionally organized in Namibia. Which ministry is in charge? Is it one ministry? Is it several ministries? including whether there has been an institutional reforms over the period of past couple of years, maybe a decade, which has led to this institutional arrangement for population register. And also maybe third question, whether in the past, civil registration services, identification services, border management, all of these services that are now incorporated in the population register, have they worked separately, and how they were institutionally brought to come to work together? So maybe brief reflection on that, on those, Tuli. I believe.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I was actually still on mute. There's the population register itself, the National Population Registration System. It is only the Ministry of Home Affairs, basically the Department of Civil Registration in the ministry. Now, beginning of sometimes in 2020, last year, we were actually merged. So what you have is the Namibian, the ministry is now responsible for Home Affairs, immigration like before, but plus safety and security, which now means even the component of the deaths that occur, that the police need to be involved in with the inquests and stuff. That one happens with NAMPO, but it's part of one ministry. But the administration of the NPRS itself, of the register itself, is with Home Affairs. But you will see that for the notifications, Ministry of Health is also involved. So they would go on the notification system to notify events that have taken place. I, who's also a civil registration official here, can actually go on to the same system. But Ministry of Health officials don't have access to the actual NPRS, call it the NPRS, National Population Registration System. The one thing with the institutional reforms also is Namibia has had a setup from the very beginning where identity management and civil registration are one and the same. So it has always been managed under the same roof. Back to you, Zoran. You are mute. Unmute.
Yes, I am. Sorry. From a more technical point of view, once you were starting building these integrated databases, could you maybe share with us what came first? What was the anchor around which population register was built? Was that ID database to which civil registration data was integrated? How it is then later on integrated with border management and other services, including how the interoperability layer will be introduced on top of all of this data.
Okay, thank you, Zoran. So what we previously had, and maybe just a little bit of a background, the previous dispensation was really such that certain population groups were not prioritized for registration of their vital events. But the one sort of main first ID that we had is what we call the Southwest Africa ID, which was much earlier on. So the database that existed was the ID database. And it was from the ID data that we had in place that the other components could be built in, but also built in such a way that when you take a person's ID record that already existed, you would build onto the other vital events that were not prioritized before. So the system is, I don't know what the correct word, administered technically from the office of the Prime Minister. And building up these systems really took steps. It was step by step built, putting one block on top of the other. We had an NPRS. Birth information would have been there, but later what has happened is the notification systems were also built up and connected to it. the system is interoperable. I think the challenge we have at the, not a challenge, maybe we just haven't gotten there yet, is ideally you would want to have other government offices, such as Ministry of the responsible for Veterans Affairs, who also have a grant, being able to actually have access themselves, but we are working on it. NPRS was introduced already in 1996, but 2010, then the births were built on, then the deaths were added 2012, marriage records were also added in 2014. The interoperability, I think, is probably one of the features that the system has that we haven't harnessed 100%. But we are getting there with a new law coming into force. Ideally this year, we will be able to do much, much better. And what also happened was there was a scanning of all historical records. So if I had a birth record that was lying in another region there in the north, it would also come and it's scanned, and at the moment you'll be able to go to my profile and get all my details. Of course, the marriages are a bit slower than all the other vital events in terms of the notification, but we are actually working now towards having e-marriages as well, where we can have marriages being notified, just like we do with the births and deaths, but this will become quite possible under the new law.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. And what I just wanted to say is that from the experience of Namibia, and I think from many other countries, building of population register, that's one of the takeaways that we can have from this discussion, doesn't take place overnight. It's not something that can be done within a year. It requires a great deal of careful planning and execution that takes quite a few years, number of years. Nevertheless, in my experience, often governments are being put off and discouraged just knowing how much time it will take to complete this entire transition. This is why I think this Namibia example is particularly important. It is important that it provides a very strong evidence what a great value one can get, or a government can get from having such an instrument fully developed and fully functional. And then the years and years, as I remember, you mentioned 1996 population register first being introduced. If I remember correctly, there were 8 years of continuous and painstaking digitization of historic records, civil registration records, just to make sure that all these past records, vital events records, have been registered and available for the population in digital format. All that painful work that was also quite expensive sort of paid off eventually when this unexpected crisis erupted and the government had to react quickly, because we cannot even quantize in terms of the amounts of money that the kind of losses that the government and the country was risking if such a system was not in place. Again, coming back to the questions from the audience, our colleague from Ms. Tian from Senegal, if I'm not wrong, is further following up on these questions and is sort of seeking for an advice, because I believe that quite a few governments across the continent are looking into ways to establish population register in the future. And ID as well as CRVS system might be within the realm of different ministries and different agencies, which then ask the question, how do we come together politically on the national level to sort of come to an agreement how we are going to build this institutionally. So I believe it's not only Ms. Tian, but other participants are seeking for sort of feedback in terms of advice. What would be your suggestion how to organize these services? Do you see the possibility for these services working as interoperable network of databases that would be then population register? Or do you see the value of only an integration of all these services under one roof of one institution?
Thank you, Zoran. Annette is also on the platform, who actually also understands the Namibian system very well. Before I deal with that issue of interoperability, I think you asked earlier on, and I missed that one, on how exactly this decision was made. What we need at a time like this is also the political will. If I tell you practically what happened with having to suspend that secrecy provision in the law, it took less than a day. At most, it was 2 days. Officials of the Ministry of Finance, under whom the grants actually resorted, having to walk over to our office. We had a very short meeting. Everybody agreed we need to tap onto the NPRS, and we walked to the Attorney General's office immediately to convince the Attorney General that this actually needs to happen. So yes, the political needs to be there, and in the time of a pandemic like this, we actually need to act quite swiftly. In terms of having system linkages, what we have as a benefit at the moment for the ministry is that safety and security now also falls under us, under one ministry, which will actually make it easier to even have systems speaking to one another because they resort under the same roof. I think what has been a challenge, even for other, even for the social protection sector, is everybody has information that they regard to be secret. So nobody is going to actually open up a system for anybody to see. But we have done some best practice studies as well. We have looked at how South Africa is even doing this, including with what can actually happen in the financial sector with the banks. What we really have in mind is, so what happens at the moment is if an insurance company, for instance, wants to confirm certain information before they can pay a claim, a letter is written. Somebody must check, write a letter, and it goes back. But when we are getting slowly to understand there's verification, there's authentication, there's some level of you just come and put your thumb and the information is verified. From what I can think of, it will actually be easier to have some of the things put in place compared to the others. But there's an e-governance project also at the national level, being spearheaded by the Office of the Prime Minister, as well as the ministry responsible for ICT, to try and have all the government, not all of them, not having one system, but having our systems that are government systems speaking to one another. Because the capability for the system to do certain things is actually it's interoperable, the information is digitized, and this should be able to happen as soon as the new law has come into place.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm sure that this issue of interoperability and the questions in relation to that aspect of the operation of the system will come up as we discuss, because it's quite peculiar, and Namibia provides quite a range of good examples and areas to learn from in the context of these discussions. But I would like to come back to what we just started a little while ago, and that is the issue when we need to coordinate. So in Namibia, the situation is that eventually population register and most of the services and the functioning of the system is within one ministry, within one department. Nevertheless, as you mentioned, Ministry of Health plays an important role, especially in the context of supplying notifications of birth and death through electronic platform that has been established between the two. Now there is an interesting question coming from our colleague Patrick, who is asking what happens, and this is sort of putting yourself in a role of devil's advocate, in case a data of not such a good quality comes through from a ministry of health facilities that are under responsibility of a different ministry, and then it is the kind of information that you receive through e-platform is not you cannot work with, and then the problem needs to be rectified. So how do you, whether you have had such experiences whether you have had the opportunity to come up with solutions that would preempt such situation, and if such situation indeed did appear, how did the coordination work in order to make sure that these are resolved quite quickly? I believe you might be. Okay.
Yes, there I am. So the way that the system works is that because the hospital is only doing the notification, and they are doing it mostly using the mother's information. The mother would have given an ID, and that ID would exist on our system, and then the other information is put in the system to notify. What would happen is a mother or the parents would have the notification done, so certain information is there. We are able to link the mother to the child. But in the event that the registrar, during the registration process that happens after notification, goes in and the information that is appearing that has been added in there is not adequate, or certain things are wrong, that notification can be rejected, and then the information is validated. I have seen that practically even the cooperation between registrars, CR, and hospital staff is so good that there are groups that are organized. If I pick up and I'm doing a registration and something is wrong, I can see who did the notification. I just pick up the phone and I call them. But with the whole purpose of the notification was really to capture the key information of the baby and who the mother is, and linking them to someone. Now, the rest of the information we still have to validate at the Ministry of Home Affairs. Obviously, if a mother goes and they are giving information that is, say, an ID number that is not correct, it will not be a match, because everything is actually done. The checks and balances are there in place. We also have e-trainers that help all the officials that are working on the notification systems. And these e-trainers, if any person has a challenge notifying a birth or a death, they just pick up the phone and they call them. Before the CRVS technical committee and steering committee were actually put in place, there was an assessment that was done to identify the gaps. This was done with the assistance of our development partners. The assessment highlighted the gaps that were there and how these gaps would actually be filled. For most of the users of the notification system, it's just continuous training that they need, but the collaboration is such that we are complementing one another. Home Affairs will look at that notification. If it's not adequate, they reject it, and then the information must be verified.
Thank you very much. This is a very, very useful learning in that if more than one ministry of one institution is involved, it is not a regulation that drives that cooperation, that says this is the letter of the regulation that says these are your obligations and this is what you should do, and these are my responsibility, this is what I should do. In fact, the communication exceeds what's written in a sort of legal language in terms of what needs to be done, and there is a quite elaborate network of services and coordination mechanisms that sort of sits on top and ensure that there is a smooth implementation of these regulations that govern a relationship between these two ministries. I would like to turn up, because we have moved into the second hour of our discussions. I would just like to quickly remind all who are attending this webinar that you have the opportunity to share your feedback, and indeed this is something that we would highly appreciate, to hear your views, positions on the topic, and to hear from you live during this webinar on any possible further questions that you might have. I think we are privileged to have quite a few distinguished national representatives of national civil registration authorities from quite a few countries across Africa, also recognized distinguished international experts in the field. I had the chance briefly to go through the list of participants, and I think we could all, for instance, benefit of the information and feedback from Mr. Alan Gelb, who is the champion of civil registration and identification systems. Did a great deal of thought leadership that sort of prompted a greater work on a global level when it comes to identification for development. So I just calling ahead of time maybe, but at any point, Mr. Gelb, if you would wish to join this discussion, please kindly press request mic. We would be very, very happy to hear from you. Also, our colleagues from UNECA are with us. Obviously, they have bird-eye overview over the situation across Africa, and therefore we would be happy to hear from your end as well your reflection in terms of what's going on, although we've heard previously from William quite a bit on what's going on the continent with regards to population register, but maybe we could hear on some of the challenges and questions that Namibia could help us with to address and use those experiences to overcome those challenges. I'm happy to see Mr. Gelb on the screen. Mr. Gelb, if you would like to take the floor and offer us a few of your observations, we would be delighted.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful.
Certainly, yes.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this meeting. Namibia is a wonderful case, actually. We have been looking across the world at examples of countries that have implemented programs to assist their citizens during the COVID pandemic. And Namibia is an outstanding case globally. It's so interesting that we've wanted to include it in our own, we have a website, G2P Network, where we try to bring together the leading cases in the world. And Namibia is now included as a net nose in that set of cases to demonstrate to countries what is possible. So thank you very much. Let me just offer a couple of questions, observations and questions about this case. The one is about the process of moving from the civil register to the population register and keeping that updated. You've mentioned marriages, for example, and the fact that, it's harder to update information like marriage in a population register. And how are you dealing with updating perhaps other information in there, such as addresses or other pieces of information, which are often difficult for countries to keep updated in their registers? I'd be interested to hear your observations on that question. Secondly, about the use of the population register in other programs offered by other ministries and agencies. Many countries do this. Many countries are now basing most of their programs on the national ID, and in particular on the national ID number. And that's a very logical way to go. And I know that Namibia is quite advanced in that area. Is the national ID number now already the basis of identification for pretty much all government services and programs, including welfare programs? Is it, for example, typically, would it be used in insurance contracts so that the only really real thing you need to do is to permit the interoperability and the system is already set up for it? That would be helpful to know. And thirdly, the question I'm curious about is the role of biometric data in your integrated system. How is this being used now? At what point is it being captured? And is it being used for routine authentication of people, as in some countries where now authentication is often through biometric mechanisms, not simply through just checking information on an ID card? How is that moving forward in Namibia? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gelb. Timureke, you have the floor.
Okay. The comprehensiveness of the register, it really has been such that for whatever reason, or maybe it was just without thinking about it, that births and deaths were sort of prioritized over marriages. Now, births and deaths, the relationship with health is there and it works quite okay. Notification is there. For marriages, the whole process of marriage, the solemnization would be done either by a magistrate or by a religious denomination, mostly by a pastor, by a church. Now, the difference between how the marriages are done and the other two vital events are done is the marriages are quite manual still. We have to rely on the solemnizing official to send us the records back for us to input that information on the system. But that one is now going to change because, you know, we're sort of creating an E. What happens with divorces, which goes alongside marriages, is that a marriage can only be annulled by the High Court. How it works now, which is not very, very good, is we have to rely on the registrar of the High Court to actually send us the physical documents so that we can update that there is a divorce against this particular marriage. But we are working also quite with it's now the Office of the Judiciary, under which the courts fall, to make sure that this information is actually pushed to us electronically. More so because the High Court, not just the High Court, the justice system has also gone E. So the court, when a case is instituted, in fact, you just need the case number, you go on to e-justice and you can read all the pleadings, you can access all the judgments. The divorce order would also be there. But it will be difficult for me to go and look for a particular divorce order because I must know the exact case number. So that one, we are also really working on to make sure that it comes on board just like the other services are. IDs are used generally as the mode that one, you identify yourself with the ID. The only problem with the ID is you only get it when you are 16 years old. That is when you can actually apply. You need it for banking services. You need it for you to enter into various contracts because for a number of legal activities, you must prove that you are a major. And the way that you do it at the moment, unfortunately, it's comparing what appears on the physical card and looking at the person that is in front of you. The biometrics that we collect at the moment, it's really just fingerprints. So what would happen even if they said death and it happened in such a way that they cannot recognize who this person is? The police would then take fingerprints from that body, send it through to us to run it against the automated fingerprint identification system. Now, the fingerprint is actually collected at the time when I apply for an ID, which is only at age 16. And there have been talks to lower that age to try and get especially children in school who are moving on to the next levels, that they can have their IDs. The fingerprint system also needs to be sort of modernized, if I may, that it should actually be able to do more than it currently does. We also now trying to look at even this project, not a project, but our intentions to actually try and get as many people to identify to verify identification of a person with us, it will actually mean we also need to get better systems. We need to make sure that the automated fingerprint system is actually doing, it's not only a fingerprint, it must actually record more information regarding a person. Yes, the ID is needed for many of the services. For example, to get married, you definitely need an ID because you need to also prove that you are major. And this is helping us a lot also in the country, because you need to have an ID for you to do certain things. So it sort of creates the demand for people to get their IDs. And if the ID can be more powerful than it actually is now, we will actually have more people with IDs than without. What was the other question? I think I've covered that. There was also an issue of access. I don't know. I don't think it came now on the floor. I think I saw it in the messages. Access on the population register is on a need to know basis. So if I am a registrar that just works with births, my access is only to the birth component of a person of a person that is recorded in there. I cannot edit other things that are on the system, and the system is built in such a way that for any change that I make, there's an audit trail. So everybody will be able to track and see who actually did what wrong. So even when we anticipate to actually do more with the system, it will still be on a need-to-know basis, with security being key in who actually can access what portion of a person's profile. I think I've covered everything. If I haven't, you must let me know.
No, thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you very much.
Soren, you're on mute.
Again, it happens. Sorry, I was on mute. Yep. Thank you very much, Mr. Gelb, and thank you very much, Ms. Timuleke. Mr. Gelb, as you are here with us and having in mind your vast expertise and global overview of the situation, perhaps if you could share with us in brief, what is your perspective on the importance of population registers in the context of distribution of emergency grants and also other government services?
Okay, thank you. I think this last period, this last year, has been quite an eye-opener in terms of how these systems can be used, because we found that in quite a number of countries have been able to launch enormous expansions in their social welfare, social protection systems. And they've done so extremely quickly. I mean, Namibia, I think, stands out as really maybe a front runner in terms of speed. But if you look at other countries, that their rollouts have also been very, very fast by historical standards. And all of this has been due to the use of electronic systems. You can look, for example, at the packages of grants that have been rolled out in countries like Pakistan, in even South Africa, which was not as fast as Namibia, in Colombia, in Brazil, in India, in a very different system. And you will see that, as colleagues at the World Bank have found too, that the countries that have managed to roll out relief to their citizens most rapidly have all had at the core of it some form of integrated system of identity management. It's been an ID system. The ID system has not always been linked with a civil registration system. So, for example, in India, let's say, the Aadhaar system is based on a mass enrollment, right, and is distinct from the civil registration system, raising the question of how that system is updated. So those systems work, but they don't necessarily update as smoothly as if they are connected to a well-functioning civil registration system. And the processes that countries have followed, they've differed country by country a little bit. But they all follow a similar kind of model, actually, to the model that Namibia has used, which is that they usually take large numbers of applications, often multiples of the actual number of people, because of multiple registrations, because of dead people, because of things like that. They check them against the register, they screen them, and here for the screening it becomes important that other government agencies are using the same system to be able to link it through with a common identifier. So, for example, does the person already get a social grant? Is the person employed in the formal sector? Is the person already getting a pension? And so on. And through that linkage, they're able to reduce the amount of loss, fraud, misdirected funding, usually by exclusion. And so that seems to be a very important lesson for countries. And I think looking to the post-COVID situation, we're going to see quite a lot of that technology, that approach being used. And some people are talking about the creation, for example, of a virtual civil registries, as virtual social registries, where instead of simply relying on a survey of the poor every 10 years or something like that, there is a continuous integration with data feeding in, for example, on employment, on taxes, on various things, which is to help the government target its social programs going forward. So I think this has been a learning period, and we're going to see a lot of thinking coming out of it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gelb. Thank you very much for sharing with us that perspective on what's going on globally for the time being. And I do agree, based on my own research, that in global context, indeed, in many respects, Namibia is a front runner in terms of advancing this system and putting it in operation. Something that Mr. Gelb, you mentioned, and we are also getting in that context questions from the participants, links to these processes of verification, something that has been part of this distribution of emergency grant in Namibia. Maybe it is worthwhile to mention that although people would apply with an ID, that ID would be verified in the National Population Register. Yeah. But the process doesn't end there. There are other sets of verification. So for a person, in order to be eligible, they cannot be pensioners. They cannot be users of student grants. They cannot be employed in formal sectors. For all of those, there are different databases operating in Namibia, and all of them are using that unique identification code that you, Mr. Gelb, mentioned, that is used across different systems. And now apart from verification of ID, other verifications are being done. So we received a question from Mr. Bangdawa Innocent, who asked, how do we preserve the privacy and protection of private data in the context of all of these verification and ensure against data leakage of personal information? I happen to know how the process worked. I know that this was done on the matching yes or no basis. So maybe Ms. Timuleke, if you could provide us more in-depth explanation about this process, where you would get the list of received ID requests and then there would be a match, not necessarily that you would send all personal information back to the private company.
Thank you very much. I also actually have my colleague is also in the meeting, Oscar somewhere. I think he can also provide some better insight at the technical level, how it actually happened. But what would happen is there would be an ID number that is sent, and then there would be codes. So we will not know everything about the person. You run that number against the system, it will show you yes, the person is alive or the person is dead, whether they fall under that particular category. But technically how it worked, my colleague Oscar can come in and amplify.
I would just suggest, if you can press a request mic, we can quickly let you on to speak. But in the meantime, I could, if we don't hear from Oscar, because I studied the process extensively, I know that each ID comes with an ID number, which is a unique identification number, and that number is then sent into the database, and the database will return, yes, we have a person that is alive under that ID number, under that name, so yes or no. And that would be sufficient. Again, we would use the same number saying, is this number in the database of people employed in formal sector or taxpayers? If the system would say, yes, we have that number in our system, that would mean that that person holding that number, and we don't know the private information of that person at any point, person holding that number is paying taxes, which means works in the formal sector, which means is not eligible to the emergency grant. If the system says, no, we don't have that number, that means that person who holds ID under that number is not employed and is not paying taxes, which means is probably eligible for emergency grant. But then the system goes to next system. It's that is this person receiving pension? If the system says no, then again, this is another proof that person qualifies for the emergency grant. So I believe that 4 or 5 different databases that are consulted on the same principle. They're not asking personal information about these people. They're using their number and they're saying, is this number in your database or no? If the database is saying we don't have that person, we don't have that number in our database, that 100% guarantees that that person meets all criteria to receive that emergency grant. And this is how it is distributed. This is how the person ends up on the list. In the meantime, I repeat once again, the code that belongs to that personal identification code that belongs to that ID is shared for verifications with different databases. The system is never asking for name, surname, date of birth, or any personal information. That's one of the useful safeguards that was introduced in the process. I'm happy to see that we have our colleague David and Mr. Gelb. If you have your own reflection on the use of this approach, we would be happy to hear from you.
Yes. I think that's absolutely right, and I would mention I think that there is a trend towards shifting the basis of identification numbers onto a random basis. As you know, some numbers provide information. They will tell you a date of birth, for example. They may provide other information embedded in the numbers. And of course, this was natural in the old days, where you want to find some way of getting information physically from a number on a card. But some of the newer systems like India use a random number, and they use it precisely so that the number does not divulge any personal information. It doesn't divulge your age or your gender or anything else about you. And I think that is a trend that slowly we're going to see. I personally think that the process of linking data in this way for the purpose of social benefits, that is something that can be managed quite well from the perspective of privacy. The risk, of course, is that if you think about the fact that the entire data systems are indexed according to the same number, there are data privacy breaches which could happen in other ways. The whole system, for example, could be breached. And that is potentially quite a serious problem. But I do think this is a privacy issue that can be managed exactly as you said.
Thank you very much. I'm also happy that we have Mr. David from UNECA with us, who would, I presume, like to share his feedback on this particular topic from the perspective from UNECA and from his own personal perspective as an expert in this field. So, David, please feel free to take the floor and unmute yourself.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Zoran. Thank you to UNECA for sharing this beautiful experience of Namibia. I think Namibia has a lot to teach all of us, I mean other countries. I like when you said the coverage of death registration is, if I remember, more than 70%. I think this is very tremendous because when you compare other countries, we only have like 8 countries in Africa that have good coverage in terms of death registration, and mainly those island countries and Arab countries. So I think this is very, very important because when you compare this with the coverage on the African continent, we have 35% of coverage, estimated, an estimate of coverage. So this means Namibia is doing a lot. And we also know that there are many countries, sub-Saharan countries, that are below 1%, or where the system is not existing. So this is very important. And on the aspect of confidentiality of data and privacy, I think shifting from the intelligent number to random number for this unique identifier number, I think this is very good because when you see what happened where I come from in Rwanda, for example, with this something that can identify people very easily, you can put some group at risk because the IED was used in the genocide to kill some of the people because they were easily identified. So we need to think how to protect the people moving from adopting this random number, depending on the local context, of course. So my other, not a question, just kind of, I think, homework for all of us is when we talk about the identity management and the population registration and all of these other systems, I think what we have enough in many countries is that we have an asymmetric investment between civil registration and current digital identity management, which prioritize the identification of authority other than ensuring the life cycle of legal identity that should begin at birth and end at death. I think our main task as UN organization or intergovernmental organization, private companies, local and international NGO and all development partners is to think how to appropriately leverage on the investment going to adult digital identification to improve civil registration in order to ensure universal capture of vital events in real time as they occur. When I talk about this, I give an example of Cameroon, for example, or Cote d'Ivoire, where we we can have cases of fraud or duplication of ID. This can be corrected by building a strong civil registration, which is digital, of course, and capable of capturing all birth within the 3 months, for example, as per their legal framework of birth. So this is really our, I think, what we all of us, we need to think how to promote the investment to civil registration using the opportunities that are out there. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you very much for that feedback and an excellent overview. Indeed, I think it is very important, and we certainly believe that this webinar will help better understand how we should direct our investments in the future, because there has been a great deal of disproportion in terms of investments on identification side of this equation, whereas there is a need for further investment in civil registration and vital statistics systems. And this instrument of population register and how it was utilized in Namibia sort of shows us that although identification is a primary instrument for application and distribution of emergency grant, in order to have this identity information accurate, for instance, whether the person is alive or dead, you need to have a civil registration system in place that on continuous basis update characteristics of identity of the person to whom that identification document is issued. One more question on the protection of privacy, because this is emerging as a main precondition for moving into development of these systems. Something of a personal observation and something that Timoleke, you mentioned earlier, that is that apart from main database that combines application and civil registration vital events of an individual, it is very important under contemporary understanding of protection of privacy that we keep record of who is accessing that information, and that person who is subject of data checking can actually know at any point of time who's been asking to look into his or her data and for what purpose. In fact, anecdotally, I know several countries where the database that stores the information, who access what information and for what purposes, in terms of number of terabytes used, is bigger than the actual database of identity that they hold. In that context, I wanted to ask you, because this is a one-time scenario because of COVID that allowed for sort of interoperability and cross-checking information involving private sector as well. When we think about long-term future, you did touch upon originally about the ongoing work on the legislation. As a practitioner manager of this service, but also a lawyer, how do you see what are the main features that should be embedded in that law to guard the privacy and data protection in the future?
Okay, thank you, Zoran. So one of the key, and this I think has really been the issue of protection of information and secrecy. And secrecy is what has actually kept data sharing at arm's length because of the fears of what people can do with the information that is contained in there. In our draft law, we had put in different categories of people and institutions who may need access to certain information. Now, the law will continue, just like it has done at the moment, to criminalize any wrongful use of the information that is obtained from the population register, it's going to also require, in addition to just criminalizing, because for criminalization, you only get to deal with it after it has happened, there will be agreements that are signed between the ministry responsible for managing the register plus the institutions that want to have access. And these agreements are also going to be gazetted. Whoever it is in the public domain must know that this is the type of information that can be shared between these institutions. But the bigger thing should really be controls that are put in the system itself to make sure, for instance, that the view that you get is only to view, not to edit anything. And you can only access after you have really been identified. But also there is a pre-existing agreement which would have identified who are the people who may actually have access. My colleagues who are more technically inclined than myself, I'm sure would be able to supplement on that one to see what the best would be. There have to be mechanisms that are put in as prevention, and then breach should also be able to be criminalized. Zoran, you were talking, but you were mute. You are still muted.
Soren, you're still muted.
Zoran? I think Zoran is experiencing problems on the other side, but his mic is still off.
Okay. Okay, this is Annette. Let me just take over in the meanwhile while Soren sort out his technical issues. Truly, thank you very much for that question. I think also one of the things is that I think what has been discussed, that service providers will only get access to data that is absolutely relevant for their mandate, and that is also what will be in some of those MOUs. I just want to also ask, in terms of the futures, what has been some of the discussions in terms to have a closer integration with some of the other social registers, so you can kind of ride on the success that you have had for the implementation of this emergency grant, which was in fact the first time that that was done in Namibia. So what has been the discussions?
Yeah. Okay, Annette, I didn't get the very first part of your intervention. Is the question how we are collaborating with other ministries?
Yes, I mean, what does the future hold? Are you going to continue to, issue another grant? And are you going to use this experience to integrate the National Population Register with some of the other social protection databases in Namibia, such as the pension database, the veteran database, and the social grant for children?
Okay, thank you, Annette. On another grant, at the moment, it's uncertain what exactly is going to happen, whether there will be another grant in order to try and alleviate the effects of COVID-19 on nationals. But we have now already seen that in the event that it happens, we are actually capable of doing the verifications to ensure that the administration of the grant is smooth. But it is my hope, and we have tried to do follow-ups afterwards to say, listen, this is what has happened with the COVID-19, and this is what we were able to do. We're trying to strengthen our collaboration even better, so that the other ministries can actually get access to a certain extent for them to be able to administer the grants that they do administer. At the moment, there are collaboration agreements with various ministries that administer different types of grants. And in terms of those collaboration agreements, it's clearly set out what needs to be shared and what for purpose it needs to be shared. It's the technical aspect that needs to be sorted out so that they can be able to do the verifications by themselves without having to pick up a phone or send an email. So we're really trusting that the lessons that we've taken from this particular administration of the grant is actually going to make the others more interested into partnering with us to have the information in their possession verified.
Thank you very much. I can see Soren is back now. He was just asked to refresh his browser. I would just like to continue to invite people to ask questions. May I just take the opportunity to ask the last question while we get Soren back on? So you have now managed to basically collect close to a complete data set for both birth, marriages, and death. What is your plans? What is the Minister of Health's plans in terms of producing mortality statistics that can inform policy? What is the plan for that at the moment? Because I know that they have not been using the death data that has been collected in the e-death notification system. Is there any plans for them to start using that to monitor mortality trends?
Thank you, Annette. I am not quite sure what is planned by the Ministry of Health and Social Services, but for the information that is in our possession, the Namibia Statistics Agency is able to use that in order to come up with different types of reports that can assist various offices, including the Ministry of Health. On what exactly they have planned, I will not be able to speak to that. But these are, of course, things that have been discussed at the CRVS technical committee level to try and see how we can use the resources at our disposal and actually use them quite optimally.
Thank you. Over to Soren.
Thank you very much, Annette. Apologies to all for these technical difficulties. I'm happy to be back. And I actually had only one question that I would like to ask and use this last opportunity to invite participants who are willing to take up any remaining question or comment that they would like to share to request a mic so that we can hear from them before we close this webinar. But I would like to move on to a last question and ask what do you see as future use cases? Where do you see major opportunities for sharing with data with other stakeholders in a controlled environment with due protection of personal data and privacy of individuals? But global experience teaches us that there are ranges of use cases where other government stakeholders can benefit from direct access for verification of identity data and provision of services. To that effect, I know that there are plans in Namibia to introduce X-Road interoperability layer. Maybe a few words to how far country has moved on with the implementation of this system, whether special legislation will be introduced in order to make it operational. Timoleke, over to you. We are not hearing you. There might be an issue with the microphone. or with until this is resolved. Maybe I could ask. I see on the screen, Mr. Gelb. Perhaps we could hear your thoughts as we approach the closing of this session.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure how my picture suddenly came up, but let me quickly respond. I think we have seen several examples of the use of this linkage with ID. One particular example that's very interesting is to encourage financial inclusion, to make it easier for people to open bank accounts. And quite a few countries have taken advantage of this situation to relax or to modify the conditions for people to open limited purpose financial accounts using just EKYC, electronic know your customer. And in EKYC, the advantage of it is that the amount of information that you need to collect from the person is minimal. Once the person has authenticated themselves, the information comes directly from the registry, goes directly to the bank account, to the financial institution. And this cuts the cost of opening and managing small accounts very much and makes it much easier. Now, Namibia has distributed its grant through e-vouchers, not actually through increasing the number of financial accounts so much in the country. But this is an interesting way to think about the future, is to use this system to reduce the cost of opening and managing accounts so that more people can have access to financial services. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This was indeed very useful and prompted me to come up with a few of my final observations for these discussions. Unfortunately, I can't see on the system that Ms. Timoleke is able to unmute herself. The microphone appears mute, something that I also experienced a little while ago. There you go. We can hear from you now.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what had happened. I keep pressing and there's no reaction. On X-Road we already have, and it's currently in use. And that is what was used for the administration of the emergency income grant. I mean, obviously we can do much better than the way that we have done it now, that the document is sent and it's run the way that it has gone. But this is something that our technical people, the Office of the Prime Minister, would be working on. But even for the collaboration agreements that have already been signed, X-Road is really going to be that platform that enables the verification to take place better than it currently does.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Indeed, Ms. Timoleke, I think this was an excellent interview. We had the opportunity to learn quite a bit more than we already knew about the system in Namibia. I think this webinar also prompted us all to probe more and to learn more about what Namibia has done over the course of last decade. For that, I throw your attention to the compendium of good practices in linking civil registration systems and identity management by the Center for Excellence for CRVS Systems, and also the brief on the experience of Namibia in distributing emergency grant right after the outbreak of COVID disease in Namibia. All of these documents provide additional wealth of data on the system. Since we did not have any further questions to offer from around this virtual floor for discussion, and we are slowly approaching the end of this webinar. Again, many thanks to Ms. Timoleke for this valuable insight. I'm happy that I have been part of these discussions, and if I could have contributed to better knowledge sharing on this important topic. For the time being, this is all from my side, and I hand it over to Annette for final words before we formally close this webinar.
Thank you very much, Soren. So first of all, thank you very much, Tule, to being part of this dialogue, this conversation. It's been very rich, and we have all learned a lot more about the Namibian system, and you have indeed done extremely well managing. As Ellen Gelb said, you've been one of the front runners for actually implementing emergency grant after the first restriction came in. So congratulations for that effort. And I think one of the key things that has also come out of this conversation is that the National Population Register, both the civil registration and the ID systems, are at the absolutely core for distribution of grants, not just during emergency, but as in general. And as you're saying, you're still working towards, integrating your system so you'll be able to more efficient manage your social grants in the future. Another thing that came up multiple times was around privacy, how important that it is that we guide citizens' privacy when we do data sharing, and it needs due consideration. And you have given some of the example on how Namibia in future will safeguard the data of the Namibian citizens. So I think that was the kind of the key reflections. There's of course a lot more that has been said, and I would just like again to say that Holly has been nice to post all the articles that has been published in the last few months about the Namibian system. We just published a new article, I believe, like yesterday, which now there's the article about the emergency grant, but there's now also an article about the notification systems and the role of the notification systems for ensuring the continuous registration of birth and death during an emergency. So I will encourage all of you to go in and read some of these articles. And thank you for all the participants that has taken part of it, for everybody who has asked questions. We really appreciate that. There is a form that is now available in the chat, so we would very much like your feedback. This is the first time that we're doing expert dialogues after we have done webinars. So we're very interesting to hear about what you actually think about this format. And last, my thank you, of course, goes to Karen and Soren and Holly and Hosea and William, who's been part of organizing this webinar. So until next time, thank you all very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.